Beaver.
Hello.
Yeah, Sam, Marianne is just running a little late.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Kyle.
Mama.
Okay. Well, I was just on the phone with Greg like 15 minutes ago. All right, well, I think we probably should go ahead and get started. Welcome to everybody who's viewing the meeting today. I'm Jamie Damon, facilitator for the Beaver Management Work Group, and that is the group that you are observing today. Our meeting goes from 2 to 4, and we'll walk through the agenda here. We've got a couple Zoom meeting tips. We won't spend much time on these. Everybody knows what we're supposed to do. Keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking, and use the video if you can. It gives us a sense of that we're actually in a real meeting when we can see each other. And of course, you make a note of Sam's number there to give her a call if you're having any trouble. I think everybody's got themselves named, so don't have to worry about that. Of course, you can use the chat, and you can use the raise hand function. We'll do our best to keep track of the raise hand. You can also just raise your hand. And again, we'll do our best to keep track of everybody in the queue. So our agenda, as I said, we're going to go till 4 o'clock today. We have, oh, here's Marianne. I've got a couple agenda items going. We've got a little update and conversation from the subgroup who continues to meet, and about a key question and limiting factors. As you recall, the subgroup has been working hard to try to frame and hone in on the information to present and discuss at our work group meetings. And so we have some information to share with you about their latest thinking and engage all of your thinking in that. And then you saw that when we sent out materials, we included a little survey looking at extending meeting times in October. And we've been talking about this for months, about bringing in our science workshops. And so the key question and limiting factors discussion is related to the science and research experts agenda topic. We have a list of folks that have been identified to us through the interviews that we've done, through subsequent conversations. ODFW staff has identified folks. And now this agenda item here today is for us to start matching up people with topics, so that you can send Sam and I off to connect with folks and line them up so that we can have some robust conversations in October at those 2 meetings. So that's what that agenda item is. And then we have a presentation from Derek and Tom. We've been hearing about ODFW and what their current authorities are, what the current program is. And the focus of their conversation today is around management options that are within their authority to do. And so, because as we're looking at making recommendations to ODFW about different things that we can be doing, either more of, less of, or better on federal land as it relates to Beaver, there were some questions about, well, what are the things that are in ODFW's authority to be able to do? Can they direct resources for habitat restoration? I mean, how do they work with federal partners to implement these kinds of programs? Just what are the options? So they're prepared to talk about that. And then last 10 minutes, we'll just confirm our next couple of meetings and what's going to be happening between now and then, and we'll be done at 4. So that is our agenda for today.
And just a quick note Yeah, just a quick note. Some of these times have shifted to give a bit more time to the presentation today. So it looks a little different than the copy we sent out previously.
Yeah, the topics are all the same, but we did shift the times a bit when we heard from some folks about needing a bit more time. So any questions, any thoughts about the agenda? Does this look like a good way to spend our time the next 2 hours? Head nods, thumbs. Okay. That's always a good sign. All right, so a couple meeting guidelines, all familiar ones we've been using since we've been meeting. We ask people, just a reminder, we have some alternates and primaries. If you're an alternate, you're welcome to be in the meeting. We ask you to be quiet and to not participate, but it's good to stay up to speed. So for all you alternates, welcome and glad you're here to listen. And for everybody else, just be mindful of speaking time. We try to give everybody a chance as best as we can. I hope that people are prepared for our conversations and leave the baggage at the door, act in good faith, and participate in an open and mutually respectful way. And that includes in the chat too. So it's we don't want to see folks trading barbs in the chat. Let's go ahead to the next slide. All right, so this is our first topic, and actually I did forget one thing, and that is Jimmy Taylor. Where are you? There he is. Hey, Jimmy. So
Hi.
Jimmy's joining us as an alternate. Jimmy, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Jamie. I'm Jimmy Taylor. I have been asked to serve as an alternate for the Oregon chapter of the Wildlife Society while Michael O'Casey is on paternity leave. My job is as a research wildlife biologist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Wildlife Research Center, and my duty station is in Corvallis.
Great. Thank you, Jimmy, and welcome. And Jimmy, like I said, is he is an alternate, but yeah. Okay. Brian?
Yeah, I just have a question on the alternate. Is there, I didn't realize that alternates were only supposed to be passive listeners.
Oh no, if you're here, if your primary person isn't here, then you are the person. You're the
Okay,
primary.
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm sorry that I didn't clarify that. If your primary and alternate are both here, we ask for the alternate to not participate. But if your primary isn't here, then you are the person. And so yeah, we do want you to participate.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Are you ready to go? Okay, Sam, you want to put that slide back up? So just a reminder, our subgroup is Jefferson, Chris, Leland, and Amy. And at our last subgroup meeting, we started to, we've presented you and had conversation about the value statement, and we've had conversation at the last meeting about the statement that we support Beaver modified landscapes, and then we had discussion in our small groups about the pros and cons around that, and barriers and constraints and opportunities around that. And then we took all that information from the subgroup conversations, worked that some more, because what we're trying to lead up to is the science workshops in October. So what are the things that we're asking our researchers and scientists to come and talk with us about? And so the subgroup came up with this key question, which is, if beaver modified floodplain landscapes are not as prevalent on federally managed land as they could be, why? And that really gets at the limiting factors. And so if you recall, if you rewind the tape all the way back to why we're here, I mean, there was this question of, stop trapping on federal land and then beaver populations will increase and we'll have all of these benefits. And we've all went, wait a minute, let's take a step back from that and see, what is it that we want beaver to be doing, or hopefully they're doing? What will a bigger beaver population, what are the results of that? And what we've talked about is that really it's the dam building activities in the floodplain, that's what we really want and hope for beaver to do. And then, if they're not doing that, what are the limitations, that are getting in the way of beaver being able to, do those activities in the areas we want them to do. And so some of the limiting factors that the subgroup identified include, stream physics and dynamics. And you heard some of that in your small groups. If Wayne was here, this was something that, he talked quite a bit about. So dispersal, are beaver, do they stay in a place? Are they spreading around? Population dynamics, how robust is the population? How persistent is it? Habitat, what are the habitat conditions to support a robust beaver population doing the activities we hope that they'll do? And then the value of backwater storage, braids, as well. And these are just some of the ones that the subgroup has come up with. And so I'm going to pause and I'm going to let each one of the subgroup members sort of give you a sense of their thinking and where we are. And then we're going to open it up for conversation with all of you. We can add to the limiting factors, because these are the issues that we're trying to address. Sam, do you have a quick question before we hear from subgroup members?
Wanted to make sure that we're just discussing, again, federally managed public lands for all of these limiting factors, right?
Yep.
Okay, that's all.
So subgroup members, who wants to go first? Chris, Leland, Amy, and Jefferson. And again, this is just for all of you to give the larger group a sense of, how we arrived at this, kind of what your thinking is, what you're looking for from the larger group around. So Chris, you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it. So, as Jamie said, we spent a bunch of time talking through the conversations that we all had in the breakout groups from the meeting before, and the problem statements that we'd established in previous meetings, and reframed the key question. And the key question actually has two questions in it, so at least the way I see it. And the two questions are from the word if at the beginning and the word why at the end. And so if you leave those two off, there's a statement. Beaver modified floodplain landscapes are not as prevalent on federally managed lands as they could be. So that's a statement. So the first question is that a true statement or not? So are they or are they not as prevalent? That is, are we seeing less or more relative to the potential? And one version of the potential might be historic, but it's the potential for beaver modified floodplain. So that's the first question, is if. And if that is the case, then why? So what are the mechanisms? And not just a single one. We had long conversations about how they overlap and interact with each other. What are the mechanisms that result in a change in the expected extent of floodplain modified habitat on federally managed lands? And floodplain modified habitat, that is beaver floodplain modified habitat. And so the kind of reasons why, limiting factors, as it were, would be the underlying physics in the streams. So the fluvial geomorphology of the streams under their current condition, that is impacted by human activity, historic and ongoing land use activity, may make the streams not as accessible for beaver dam building, beaver floodplain modification. So the animals are there may or may not be the food, but it's just too difficult a situation for beavers to take control of the hydraulics. So that would be one of those potential limiting factors. Similarly with dispersal, the animals are in areas or adjacent to, maybe off of the federal lands, but can't get to those possible places because of dispersal barriers, and any number of reasons why there are dispersal barriers. Population dynamics idea covers lots of things, from mortality and births being out of balance for any number of reasons. It also, the overall population dynamics with beaver basic biology results in dispersing subadults, and those are the ones that will be establishing new areas. And so if there's establishment limitation, that could come from the underlying population dynamics, that there is, in a sense, there isn't excess production to make dispersing individuals to add to the footprint of modified floodplain habitat on federal lands. Could just be that the habitat, not from the just physics of the streams, perhaps vegetation, is not conducive for beavers to establish these sort of central place foraging environments that floodplain modified habitat and sort of dam-based colonies require. And the backwater storage braids, so all these ideas of things that are the benefits, those things tend to come from beaver already modifying the habitat. And so if the environment is already modified, then they can reoccupy. And there's a long history of beaver leaving and reoccupying modified habitat. And so this is the idea that if there isn't even a legacy beaver modified habitat, then it might be hard for them to reestablish colonies and then change the landscape. So that's a quick rundown of how I think we got to and the kind of factors that we threw out there as part of the why aspect of the question. We didn't talk so much about the if, but we put it in there as an option because it sort of shortcuts everything if the answer is no. But if the answer is that there is option for increasing the amount of beaver modified floodplain habitat, then from a management perspective, we need to understand the physical and biological mechanisms and then what management tools can apply. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. I see Jefferson's got his hand up next, and then we'll hear from Leland and Amy.
There we go. Yeah, and I think we also thought it would make the discussion more efficient if we were really just looking at the limiting factors in isolation and not jumping to, we can fix this by doing this, or we're just looking at kind of conceptual biology was my understanding, and not skipping ahead to solutions or how to address them necessarily, but just understanding what factors could be in play. The other thing was that in regards to if there's a lot of discussion about previous and current beaver numbers or conditions and such, and really it only seems like that also is going to create a lot of turmoil, and that I think a lot of times when people have referred to the if, it's a comparison of now versus the past, and that we can almost just establish and look at what we have right now. The past can be a guide of potential and as a point of discussion, but what we have right now and looking forward towards climate change and what we actually need relative to limiting factors here and how things might change. Thanks.
Thanks, Jefferson. Greg, you got a question? You have a question for us?
Yeah, I'm just curious of how the factor of harvest was discussed in talking about limiting factors, since the ultimate question coming before the commission at some point is, should there be beaver harvest in public lands? So how did the discussion, this for anyone on the committee or the subgroup, how did that factor in?
I'll jump in on that. Honestly, the factor of harvest was discussed probably in population dynamics a bit, but not tremendously. We've really moved to more of this, overall management and beaver health topic, and less factored on harvest and trapping specific topics. So under that population dynamics, when we talk about population numbers and mortality effects, that was one thing that I think was mentioned in there, but not a heavy emphasis put on that in the conversation when we're talking about kind of these overall limiting factors that need to be considered.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks, Amy. Anybody else?
Chris, do you want to address what Greg just said before we hear from Leland?
Yeah, just really quickly, that's a great observation, Greg. The way it comes in is we tried to bring in limiting factors that we could link with ODFW's management capacity as we understood it. And so certainly the ODFW has a management role in regulating human-caused mortality, but that fits into population dynamics because there are that's added into the vital rates that exist as as basically controls of populations, and so some factor of that falls into population dynamics, as well as the timing and perhaps type of individual that might be taken from the population by different sources of mortality. So yeah, it's buried in there, but probably could list a number of pieces of population dynamics, but they're in the control of mortality factors that are in ODFW's statutory authority. But that's a good question.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
All right, Leland, you're up.
Yeah, I mean, quickly thinking about harvest, this working group has kind of shifted away from this exclusive focus on harvest, with an understanding that what we're talking about is the benefit of beaver modified floodplain landscapes and how we improve management around those benefits. A discussion around harvest, there's been a lot of talk around, well, population is not necessarily the focus that we're looking at. We're looking at the actual behavior and that behavior's impacts onto the ecosystem. So we can go back to harvest if we want, but that seems to kind of miss the point of the working group to a certain extent at this time. The focus of this key question again is on modified floodplain landscapes, and that if question is really important because it gets at a couple of things. There's questions about whether or not that behavior is not occurring due to these individual factors, or if it's just a natural response that we're seeing on the landscape. I mean, they're occupying habitats and they're using the habitats as beaver see fit, and we may or may not see modified floodplain landscapes where things are now. So this lets us get at some very basic questions about what we do know and what we don't know and move from there. If we don't know what we don't know, then we don't know what we're answering. We don't know what we're trying to solve. And that's really has to be step one in figuring all of this out. It's a pretty complicated process around looking at beaver influence on ecosystems. And this question establishes the foundation for the future discussion around management.
Thanks, Leland.
Okay, so we've got Amy, who is our last. Leland, was there anything else you wanted to add from the subgroup members' perspective? Because you were really focused on answering Greg's question.
I mean, from the subgroup, I think it gets to the same thing, right? I mean, we've established kind of the value statements for the entire working group. This focuses in a little closer on how to look at management in a way that fulfills that value statement. It does, like, again, the big piece is trying to figure out what we do know, what we don't know, what factors we may be able to influence, and what factors we don't know exactly how to influence yet, and what we can do to figure out new novel management strategies that may let us provide these benefits to the maximum number of citizens in the state, which is really the charge of ODFW.
Okay, thanks, Leland. All right, Amy, you're the last of the subgroup members to weigh in, and then we've got Jefferson, Marianne, and Ernie on deck to start the conversation going. So go ahead.
Yeah, kind of similar to what Leland was just saying, and to take what Chris said about, if you take the if and the why, off of this, and you've got this statement, but the if and the why set us up, I think, as we go through this, the if and the why set us up for the next few meetings to answer the question, right? That's what allows us to get to the research and the science that are going to give us, kind of prove the statement. So it sets us up for the next few meetings where we bring some folks in to really discuss, like Leland said, what we know and what we don't know. And it also gave us a statement that then we could say, okay, now let's apply the lens of what ODFW's jurisdiction or management can do as we look at it through this statement. And so I feel confident with where we got to on this. And particularly listing out these limiting factors that we kind of discussed in the meeting as well. So I felt like it gave us a really good jumping off point to get to some really substantive conversation within the work groups and drive the, give the whole work group kind of this thing to anchor into, so we can really make use of these last couple of meetings. Because that was one of the discussions too that we had, in the subgroup was, it feels at the same time, it feels like we just started this and we've also been on these Zoom calls for a long time, right? But we only have a handful of meetings left, till the end of the year. And so I think this sets us up to try to make the most of those and hopefully reach something collaborative and something that is palatable that we can come out of this with.
Thanks, Amy. Jefferson?
Yeah, thanks. So just on that population dynamics and kind of mortality aspect, just to get people's minds thinking about things, to not think about these bullet points as individual, because you can think of how mortality from any source is going to affect habitat when you're talking about a creature that creates its own habitat or maintains its own habitat. So thinking more holistically about how mortality or population dynamics doesn't just relate to population dynamics, it relates to other things that can have feedback loops. We are talking a lot differently about trapping and that sort of thing. And I think it is important to note that rather than taking options off the table, we're putting more options on the table and thinking more holistically. Because when we started out and it was just trapping versus non-trapping, it was non-productive. And so talking about beaver management and just how we discuss things in general is a lot more useful and really takes in a bigger picture. I feel as though there is a consensus among scientists that beaver modified landscapes are less prevalent than they could be, and I feel like one way that we should be thinking is that looking basically for some sort of substantial proof that we might have missed otherwise that says that they're not. And so I would be interested in if anyone can come up with that, just as a way to move on to other questions, but maybe I'm being too optimistic. So.
Thanks, Jefferson. Marianne?
Mine's kind of, I think it gets at a lot of pieces that a lot of folks have been probably talking around a little more detail than I have, but my only kind of comment on this formatting is that not as prevalent as on federally managed land as they could be, is a tough metric to meet. And I don't know if that's, and again, I'm not saying we need like a population level or something, because we're talking about the landscapes. but it does strike me that that's, everyone's probably going to have a different sense of what could be. And that makes it a bit of a challenging question to have a definitive answer to.
Ernie?
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to try to pull together several things that I just heard, and I really do appreciate the work that everybody put in on this. The statement that is there is in present tense, and that concerns me. It's certainly interesting of how did we get here to know about are the modified landscapes prevalent as they could be right now, but the future is going to be much different than it is right now. At least that's what we hear from all of the research on climate change and on biodiversity. And so it seems to me the real question that this group ought to be focused on is, are there risks that beaver modified floodplain landscapes will not be as prevalent on federally managed land as they could be in the future? And that we need to focus there, and not just on the margin. That's a really big issue. It is, a red light, red flag situation. Now, Google is a wonderful thing, and I happen to just come across something produced by the Climate Change Adaptation and Beaver Management Team as part of a joint implementation working group of federal agencies, state agencies, and tribes. And in that report, which essentially is a summary of the science, interdisciplinary look at the science in 2014, and I can post the link if you'd like. There's a statement that says existing beaver populations are commonly below historic levels and below potential distribution estimated in restoration tools. Now, if that's what a review of the science found in 2014, it seems to me that it would be prudent for us, especially since we don't have very much time, even if there is no shutdown of the government. And if there is, then we have even less time, that we ought to adapt as the null hypothesis that beaver modified floodplain landscapes will not be as prevalent on federally managed land as they could be in the future. And that's where we begin. And then we start looking at, so how do we correct that in order to provide more benefits for all Oregonians? Because if we spend more time on, is it this or is it that? Or, what happened, what didn't happen? Was it hunting and trapping or not? We're just using up time that I don't think we have. And I've seen too many of these processes that at the end they run out of time, and so they start using general language that it ends up being meaningless language. And I'm not very interested in that. I would like for us to come up with meaningful recommendations to the department and the commission for increasing the benefits that beaver provide to Oregonians. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Ernie. And Ernie, it would be great if you could put that in the that link in the chat that you mentioned. Leland?
Yeah, I think this gets back to some of the back and forth we've had from the very beginning here, is that, there's a lot of assumptions that are made. As far as I know, that there's no actual reliable estimates of historic beaver populations, and there's no reliable current estimate of beaver populations. So if we're going to make those claims, what are we basing those on? We can make estimates that there is available habitat that we expect to be inhabited by beaver, and the habitat or the slope appears to be appropriate for dam building behavior. But that does not necessarily mean that there is dam building behavior or that beaver are going to occupy those landscapes. So I think we've got to be really careful with the comments that we make in making recommendations in this, so that we do have some basis in fact in making these recommendations. What we can do is look at some of the research that has been done in Oregon, look at how beaver are actually using the current landscape that we have available, and see if there are ways to improve that. Are there changes in habitat that we might be able to make? Are there changes in dispersal? What do we know? What don't we know? I think it's pretty well established that we don't know very much about beaver populations. That's happened every meeting we've had this conversation. So this is not a new piece of information that's coming across. There are lots of people saying, yes, we think that there's a lot less. Sure. Where there's also probably a lot less habitat now as well. So, okay, that really doesn't tell us very much on ways to move forward until we have some basis and some peer-reviewed research that lets us make some kind of solid decision making.
Danielle?
Thank you. I was just thinking that, you know, all these limiting factors I think are important, and, you know, thinking again, as Jefferson said, holistically, that they all have a role to play for sure. And I'm curious to see, especially as it relates to ODFW's authority and what can be done in way of all management related to all those limiting factors. You know, because my brain's kind of going to, what do we have control over in the short term? What do we have control over in the long term? And by we, I just mean people, because some of this feels like sort of passive control, like maybe if we, you know, manage X or Y or Z differently, perhaps we have some impact on some of these. But to me, at the end of the day, you know, just reading that key question, if a dead beaver cannot modify a floodplain landscape. So to me, that is one of the biggest limiting factors, is if you don't have beaver present, you cannot have any of these other things. And yes, I understand that these work in concert together, but at the end of the day, a lack of presence of beaver will mean a lack of all these other things as well. So that's where my brain is right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. And just to, you had mentioned about, you know, what do we have control over? What actually can we do? And we've asked, ODFW is going to talk about that in today's meeting as well, starting so we can start to match these things up. Because kind of like what Ernie said is, you know, we really need to start focusing in on, it's like, yes, there's information we need to have to sort of settle out. It's like we all agree that we want more beaver in some areas to do these activities, that it's beneficial, but we don't have a good sense of, you know, what's happening now. I mean, there's that piece. And then the other piece is, you know, what can we do more of, less of, better to support those populations in the areas that we want them to be. So that's exactly, yeah. So focusing in on that is what we're trying to do. So I really appreciate, you know, all of the comments that have come in so far. I want to do a time check. It's 20 minutes before the hour. So we're just a few minutes over this agenda item before we switch over to looking at the research. How about we take another 10 minutes for this discussion, because we've got a number of hands up, and then move over to looking at the researchers as they relate to these questions, so that we can get your thoughts on that. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in the queue. Anybody else want to get in the queue? Because that helps me understand how much more time we need. 6. Okay. All right. So Amy, you'll be our last person. Let's see if we can move through all your comments in about 10 minutes. So Darren.
Just wanted to put down 3 things that should be under limiting factors: would be funding, staffing, cultural and political support are 3 that I would like to see in those limiting factors too.
Sam, are you able to modify this live while we're to add those?
Yep, I can do that.
Thanks. Did you get all of what Darren said?
I believe so. Correct me if I'm wrong, Darren.
Thanks, Darren. Jefferson?
Yeah. This wasn't what I was going to say originally, but Danielle brings up a good point that makes me think about just these various factors, and that just because something has its own bullet on the list there doesn't mean it's equally weighted as something else. And we're not putting these in any order or anything like that. There can be different factors underneath, but I kind of, in my mind, looking at them, I see them into three kind of things, kind of a three categories. One is kind of intrinsic, that's just inherent to the landscape, or like, Leland says, there's a Walmart built on the floodplain, so now beaver can't be there, that are kind of unchangeable. So there's things that have happened that are unchangeable, but that then in my mind makes the things that we could possibly change be even more important and put more pressure on those as options with levers to pull. So it becomes more important to think about those aspects. The other thing that was brought up is that we do get into these back and forth discussions of, well, yes, there were more beavers. Yes, no, there weren't more beavers. And then it usually kind of fizzles out when we say, well, we just don't know enough. And I'd really like people's feedback of how the people who feel that they have the evidence on either side could best bring that forward. Because I think that the scientists, from what I've heard of them and what I read in my research, that it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that the landscape has looked dramatically different in the past, and that there's quite good documentation of that. So I'd like to understand a little bit better what sort of medium or way of conveying that information people would be most interested in, because just like the non-dam building beavers and dam building beavers kind of thing, I feel like I'm just happy to share more information.
Okay, thanks, Jefferson. Leland?
Thanks. I just wanted to bring up another point that we talked about specifically in the subgroup was differences in different ecotypes. Dam building occurring in one ecotype may be very different than dam building behavior on a different ecotype. So I think that's something that we talk about as part of habitat, but also something that I think it's really important to be considering within the larger context. If beaver in the coast range are less likely or more likely, and I'm not making a claim either way, but there is some probability in likelihood of dam building behavior depending on the ecotype. So something that also should be considered. Just to answer Jefferson's question, I think this is the challenge, right? I mean, there's a lot of assumptions that are made about what the habitat was like previously by everybody, and what populations were like previously by lots of folks. But the reality is we don't really have good information on a lot of this, which was my understanding in part of why there was a shift to talking about beaver modified floodplain landscapes instead of populations. That was part of the decision made within this group to refocus on those ecosystem benefits as what the management focus needed to be. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Leland. Chris?
Yeah, just to carry on what Leland just said, part of the, and also I will agree and disagree with what Leland just said just now, and part of our discussion in the subgroup was focusing on what we did know and could see and could quantify. And back to Marianne's question about how to quantify these things if they're performance measures. The amount of beaver modified floodplain habitat is something that's very easy to quantify. You can see it from space. You can also see from space where you might expect that. And the reason you can see from space where you might expect it is because of where it has been in the past. So the role of beaver in stream hydraulics and as participating in the physical transport deposition balance in stream systems has changed the landscape in the Northern Hemisphere over the last several million years. And we can see the fact that they have been a transformative agent everywhere because we have alluvial deposits across the landforms. In the 50s, fluvial geomorphologists, when beavers were gone, came up with how fluvial deposition happened. Leopold and Woolman built these models because of the ecological and biological world in front of them. Beaver were gone as a transformative agent. When geomorphologists trench through floodplain habitat, you're finding lacustrine deposits, lake-like deposits, not just these migrating bar, point bar kind of deposits. That is, these floodplains that we think of as just the flat valley floors that aren't inhabited by beaver now were formed by the biological processes that beaver and vegetation generated over millions of years. And so it's impossible for us to say that beaver have not existed and beaver modified habitats have not existed at much higher levels than they do now, because our planet wouldn't look the way it does if that weren't the case. And no, we weren't around. No, we don't have pictures. But what is left behind is the behavior of this transformative creature and what it does to make habitat to make its living. And we can't deny that. And the question then is, how little of that current formative activity is going on relative to what sort of the standing crop of maintained beaver floodplain habitat. Thanks.
Okay, we've got 4 people. So we are rapidly closing in on the amount of time that we have for this conversation. I want to make sure that we give ODFW enough time to talk about what they're prepared to talk about. So if we can get through the hands that are up and have no more hands up for this part of the conversation, then at least we can introduce the science, piece, and maybe that's something we can populate. Anyway, I want to make sure to put that up on the screen. So Samantha, go ahead.
Sorry, I had to get to the point where I could unmute myself. I just wanted to make sure too, on the limiting factors list, after Danielle spoke a bit about how beaver cannot, create these modified floodplain landscapes if they are dead. I just want to make sure that human caused mortality is a limiting factor, because it does limit, how beaver can transform these landscapes. And I didn't see it written down after Danielle had mentioned it. And I just want to make sure, maybe it's under population dynamics. I don't know, but I just want to make sure that was in there.
Yeah, we had talked about it being a part of population dynamics. So that's where it lives.
Okay, that's all I needed to know. That was my only clarification point. Thanks.
Amy?
Yeah, and a little bit to what Sam and Danielle had mentioned as well. And this is something that we've talked about in the subgroup and in the larger group as well, is, are we looking at, do we want to improve the ecological, my speaking ability, do we want to improve that? Do we want to improve the ecological function on the landscape, or do we want more beavers? Because we've been told repeatedly that the actual number of beavers is not necessarily what we're looking at when we've had these conversations. And so while there's overlap between those two questions, I feel like those are two very different management questions, right? Are we looking to try to make management decisions for, because we want more beavers out there, or do we want to really focus in on the improvement of the function of the beavers that are on the landscape? And that is something that keeps kind of coming back around, in the conversations. And I do feel like that's a a question that this group is probably going to have to kind of address and nail down if to know where we're going with this. You know, as it relates to the question that's on the screen here, and then as it relates to what kind of management strategies we can look at inside the lens of ODFW's jurisdiction as well. And so we kind of have to layer all those together to get some kind of an outcome. But that, I believe that question will be something the group has to kind of look at and answer if we're really going to find traction on any of this.
Thanks, Amy. Marianne?
Yeah, I think Amy somewhat was getting at what I was wanting to say too. Is I feel like some of these, well, I feel like some of these are kind of research related questions where there's definitely going to be two perspectives. And so I'm, you know, again, when we get to, I think I'm a little confused about the end game here, because if this is kind of driving where research is heading, I think that's really great. If this is supposed to be something that we're kind of reaching consensus on these limiting factors, I think I have a lot more and different feedback.
Yeah, and we're not looking for, we're not looking for consensus on the limiting factors. It's more of a conversation about, you know, how do we dive into this? What's the information we need to bring forward around these limiting factors that helps us to figure out what are the management options that this group would want to propose? And so that's more the nexus that we're trying to get at. All of this is a way just to, you know, we're trying to organize the conversation and narrow it down so that we can get to what a number of you have said, which is, you know, I mean, Ernie said it, I mean, a number of you said it, that, you know, we've got to, I mean, what is it that we can control? And, you know, what is it that's within ODFW's authority? And, you know, where should they focus their attention so that we can have more Beaver doing the work that we hope that they will do? And how do these limiting factors, I mean, if we dive into these different limiting factors, how does that help us to figure out what those management objectives are? So it's not a consensus activity. It's more of a, you know, let's get more specific with what we're trying to address. Boone?
Yes, hello, can you hear me? Yeah, I just wanted to kind of put us back on. Quite often we've had a couple of red herrings today thrown at us, you know, making these analogies that Walmarts don't exist on public land. So we don't need to be, you know, using, you know, straw men or whatever in those sorts of discussions, because the public lands, the federal lands, federally managed lands, you know, haven't been degraded to the same extent permanently as many of the private lands, and that includes stream modification. And I was really surprised at these limiting factors, how indirect and incomplete they are. If one was really doing with the knowledge of public lands and how riparian zones and beavers interact in aquatic ecosystems, on public lands, I think the first two things that any person with experience on public lands would say: land management and animal management. That's the first two limiting factors we should be addressing. How is public lands management, i.e. affecting habitat and competitors with beavers? And two is, how does trapping, the purposeful removal of animals, affect these populations? And so I just see these limiting factors as really pleasing no one. They're scientifically incomplete, and they are skating around the real gorilla in the room, and that's land management and animal management. I can't imagine not going through public lands. It's very clear there are beaver landscapes not prevalent. There are suitable areas. Like we said, we can see this on remote sensing. We can see it through geomorphic data. You can see it through evidence of past beaver dams. So that's my 2 cents for the moment. Thanks.
So Boone, I mean, if you were to take your two big categories of land management, animal management, wouldn't you see that a number of these items would fit as sub items under that?
Yeah, but they're watered down here. Habitat. Well, we know there's suitable habitat, and there would be a lot more suitable habitat where, well, there's, first of all, there is suitable habitat out there. There are empty niches, empty habitats right now on federal lands throughout the state of Oregon, throughout the Western United States, really throughout the continental United States, that aren't occupied by beavers right now. And that's largely due to the synergy of dispersal limitations by through trapping and in concert with physical aspects. So you really should be separating out natural limiting factors of beaver and suitable beaver habitat on the landscape with anthropogenic factors that really are things that we can deal with, that we can manage. And that is either through population dynamics and trapping, or through habitat improvement and improved land management to create suitable beaver habitat where it might not exist today.
Yeah, so I don't know that, well, anyway, I don't want to dwell on it, but I don't think I think what you're saying is not inconsistent with where the subgroup is going. I think it's organized differently, in your brain, but I don't think it's inconsistent with what they've been talking about. But I don't want to dwell on it because we've got Stan's hand up, Leland and Jefferson. And
well, other than the fact that the public would understand, and ODFW can manage trapping. They can't, and habitat improvement. And these are the things that the public and the anthropogenic impacts, and not, these indirect hidden factors as we have here. I'm just trying to be clearer, and maybe I'm being more of an editor as anything else. But
and we'll hear more.
This is a very unsatisfying set of limiting factors.
I hear that from you. And we'll be hearing more from ODFW about, what the range of management options are, and that they can use, here in like 10 minutes. So let's get through the hands we have up: Leland, Jefferson, Amy, and Stan. And then Stan, I need you to be the last person to speak on this topic so that we can get to the next presentation. So everybody, no more hands up after Stan? Okay, Leland?
Sure. I think we keep coming around to the same thing. There seems to be continued assumptions that because some type of habitat exists, beaver are going to be in it. But that isn't necessarily borne out in the available research, and that a lot of what we identify as suitable habitat is not filled by beaver territories. And oftentimes there's space left in between, and we see a smaller portion of that occupied. Now, whether or not there are ways to improve habitats, to look at ways that we're seeing an increase in beaver modified floodplain landscapes is an important question. But we've got to be careful to not project what we think they should be doing onto the species, because they don't care. And I'll stop there because my dog's decided she wants to bark right now.
Okay, thanks, Leland. Jefferson?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. Boone, I think you have a good point in the anthropogenic and kind of inherent. I don't know what the other characteristics would be. And maybe if we talk about habitat generally, there's habitat that is inherently not going to be good for beaver, and there's habitat that could be human modified. And so in this aspect, just looking at the overall general, and then the next idea literally is to look at what is it that we can impact and affect, and then zero in on that. And then the next step is, what does ODFW have that it can zero in on? But just trying to get the general lay of the land there, I think is going to be really important. And so So yes, but like next step.
Thanks, Jefferson. Amy?
Yeah, I just want to push back a little bit on this, what I think I'm hearing Boone say, in that if there are not beavers in a specific niche, that's being laid at the foot of harvest and trappers. And I think that's a pretty narrow scope. I think there's a lot of, I mean, if we want to talk about mortality reasons, great, let's talk about predation, and let's talk about all of the aspects, disease and everything else that goes into that. To lay that at the foot of harvest alone, I think is a very narrow focus, and one that I don't believe we have, science to prove that trappers are making that kind of an impact on beaver populations.
Thanks, Amy. All right, Stan, your hand is down, but it was still up, right?
Yes, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Well, I want to thank Boone for being consistent in his advocacy to say that trapping is the root cause of the beaver dilemma that we're talking about, or controversy. But I'm going to kind of follow up with what Amy just said. And Boone, we've been hearing this since the petition when you were testifying on that and others. So for us, would you please provide this work group with the empirical data that shows Oregon's current beaver management policies and harvest regulations are the major limiting factor, the only factor that if we remove that, we will have beaver spread clear across this landscape. So once again, the Oregon Trappers Association asking Boone Kaufman to provide empirical data, research that identifies that beaver trapping in Oregon under the current regulation is the major limiting factor.
Thanks, Stan. I see Boone taking notes.
May I respond? First of all, I didn't say that it's the whatever Stan just said, the only limiting factor. I said it is a limiting factor in many areas, and that it would, I think that the hypothesis would be, as there are several studies, and I'm happy to provide those studies. And I thought we've already done that at one point in time. Studies throughout the United States, and has shown beavers increase when trapping is halted on areas. And I didn't say right now that it was the only limiting factor, but I'm saying there are watersheds where it is the limiting factor. I think that habitat degradation by other land uses is also a limiting factor. So make it very clear that I don't believe that trapping is the only limiting factor. It is in many cases, but not the only one.
So
thanks for that clarification, Boone.
So I would like to have a few seconds to rebut that, or add to it. And that would be to have Boone show us the data, highlight those drainages where you feel trapping currently is a limiting factor then in Oregon. You say there are some drainages. So show us those drainages, and then possibly we can work towards goals to solve that problem in those drainages. We would have to have a much more expansive discussion about why trapping in those drainages has been the major causation of a lack of beaver. So if you can give us those drainages in Oregon that you've identified that are caused beaver population dynamics or change through trapping, we would greatly appreciate that data.
Thank you,
Maybe
Stan.
you tell me the drainages that where it hasn't been, if you'll spend that effort. So that's ridiculous. That's another straw man you're putting up there. So
well,
I think if I can pause you guys.
Yes,
so
right.
I think what we're trying to get at here, though, I mean, taking a step back, is that, the subgroup has talked about this, we're talking about it here, is that we recognize that there's a connection between habitat suitability and thriving beaver populations, as well as that there's potentially a connection with anthropogenic input or impacts and thriving beaver population. And I think the nexus that we're trying to get at is, if we're focused on federal land, and we where are those areas that we want the most robust population to provide the, the beaver activity that we hope that they will provide. Where are those? So I think that, the two of you, that little conversation you just had is sort of getting at that nugget, which is, what's the criteria? What are the areas? What are the types? What is ODFW's role in that? What is ODFW's role together with other partners in affecting change in those ecosystems? So I think, we're trying to get there. So I appreciate the back and forth of you guys, even though we didn't quite resolve it. Ernie.
Thank you. I have a couple of comments. One is I wanted to point out that, again, Stan, you were misrepresenting what Boone said, and you've done that twice to me. So I wish that you would please stop that. The second is the last comment that I understood Boone to make, and that is, in the context of the stresses coming towards us, the dramatic economic and biological risks coming towards us over the horizon, we should begin with the assumption that killing beavers has a negative effect on the ability of beavers to provide those benefits until we have evidence that that's not a correct assumption. To go the other direction just leaves us with business as usual and continues to increase the likelihood that we will lose streams, that we will have wildfires spreading across the landscape without having beaver habitat stopping them, without having beavers providing clean water and habitat for fish and all of that. This requires a different change in mindset. Thank you.
So I have to be able to respond.
Stan, what do you need to say?
So I've been holding back for quite some time. I'm a note taker. And so I have what Boone said written down. I don't feel I misrepresented it whatsoever. But the thing is I guess if we're going to apply this mentality, then we shouldn't have any harvest opportunities on coho salmon. We shouldn't have any harvest opportunities on any ESA, an exception to those rules that are ESA rules. It really does puzzle me where this discussion's going and how all of the circular discussion that we're having. So possibly it's time for us just to cut to the chase. And I for one, Ernie, I don't think I'm misrepresenting what's being said.
So I would love for us to be able to hear from ODFW, because they have prepared some information to share with us about what's possible within their management authority around management options. And I just want to remind everybody that, we have the agreement, tentative, I guess, as it is, that we're trying to build on here, is that there is agreement in this group that beaver can play a positive role on, we had that value statement. I don't have it right in front of me, but we all were like, yeah, let's move forward from there. The next part is, it's like, okay, then what are the limiting factors and what are the options to address those within ODFW's management authority on federal land? And so we're trying to move that conversation, in that direction, recognizing that anthropogenic input harvest is a piece of that. I think everybody can agree that that's a piece of that, but also habitat is a piece of that. To what extent can the ODFW affect habitat? We want to hear from them. That's part of what they prepared to talk with us about, is the range of ways that they can affect population and habitat around land management and animal management. And so I think, what I would like to do is move us into that conversation so we can hear from Derek and Tom, and see, how that matches up with addressing some of these limiting factors. And that's where we go. I mean, that's the basis of our recommendations. That's where we need to head. So Leland and Amy, I'm going to ask that you put your hands down so that we can get to that presentation, because we haven't Amy's like, no way. What, Amy?
I feel like I just need to say something real quick in response to Ernie's suggestion there. And we can't just switch the mindset to say future things coming at us, this, that. Management practice decisions, wildlife management decisions have to be based in scientific research. And it has to be shown that what we're doing now is not sustainable. What we're doing now is detrimental. And these are the reasons why, and this is what we're going to change to make things better. We have to come at it from that perspective. We can't just throw our hands up and say, you know, climate change and this and that and the other are coming over the horizon at us, so now we must assume these things. We don't make wildlife management decisions on assumptions. We must make them on research-based decisions. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Greg?
No, I don't have any comment. I'll just put a comment in the chat. We need to move on. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, deep breath, everybody. Derek, Tom, are you guys
Before
ready
you
to
move
share?
on, before you move on, Jamie, some of us don't do chat. So if this is a public setting, it has to be out in front of the public. Because
So
if you're,
Stan, are you saying you can't see the chat?
I don't even use it.
But you
Is
can't.
it? I don't believe it was even a part of our format that a lot of this discussion would be taking place in chat.
Yeah, I understand that. And it's so all the chat does become part of the meeting record. And so you get to see everything that's in there and what's been in there. And that's a really fair comment, Stan. And so what's been put in there so far is what I asked Ernie to put a link in there about that study that he referenced. And so that'll be part of the meeting summary. So you'll get that. Jefferson said, great discussion, everyone. Really appreciate folks' input. Brian was concurring with what Chris's comments said earlier. Marianne was very concerned about allegations against private landowners, that the private lands are not better, that there are private lands that are better managed than federal lands. And so, and again, all of this will be in the meeting summary. Brian has to leave, he apologizes, and he put in a link to, or some information about someone that we should follow up with that could be helpful around riparian habitat. Greg wrote that no one is saying that beaver trapping is the major limiting factor. And Becky writes in, what do the relationships in Oregon need to look like to have more beaver modified floodplains with healthy beaver populations? And I take the time to read that, Stan, in part because our viewers can't see the chat either.
That's correct.
So I appreciate you bringing that up. Greg?
Jamie, could I just say, just for your benefit, Stan, since you don't use the chat, I would just say that our department practices adaptive management, and we practice adaptive management in anticipation of changing climate. We do have a climate plan, and our staff consider the science that has occurred on climate change in its decision making. You've seen that we have made, you use coho and Chinook salmon as an example. We have been closing down fisheries as a result of what's occurring because of climate change, because of drought conditions that we have. So this is science that our department uses. It's adaptive management. It's not something kind of a wild imagination out into the future. It's happening now and it's happening in the future. And this is how our department is operating now. Thanks.
Thanks for that clarification, Greg. Let's move to Derek and Tom, because they did prepare some information. And again, this is around what's within their authority, the range of management options that include land as well as animal management, and some examples that they've done working with partners. And so Derek and Tom, I don't know who's going to go first.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I'll get started off first here, and I will run through some of the beaver specific topics or the areas of management tools, management scope, and then I'll pass it off to Tom to talk more about perspectives from the fisheries, from the water side, from the beaver related structures perspective. So I apologize if I venture into some areas outside of federal lands, but I think I'm going to try to keep it focused to that front. And then once we're all said and done, I think we'll just enter into Q&A and talk more about what some of these details mean or what they could mean. So first off, as beaver are classified as a fur bearer, all forms of take of beaver are regulated. That means harvest, but also beaver taken on damage, beavers being captured and held, moved, relocated, or even for research purposes. If you're going to lay hands on the animal or disturb an animal or harass an animal, they have to get a permit through ODFW. So we have that authority to pretty much regulate all forms of take. Similarly, along those lines, we have a law enforcement branch to be able to enforce those regulations. We also have that ability to work with law enforcement, get information on potential illegal activities, and that being any sort of a limitation of populations. We have a wildlife population health lab. We have wildlife veterinarians on staff, and so we can specialize and focus in on disease and disease issues and what those disease issues may have for our fur bearer populations. And we also take into consideration predation and predator management. We have the ability to focus on predator management. Hasn't really come up for beaver, but certainly it's a topic for a number of other species, and that tool is very much in our toolbox. Continuing on from some of the requirements and the hoops that folks have to jump through, reintroductions, that's another major topic, or just moving beaver. We talk about if there's suitable habitat that is unoccupied, and if there is some sort of hurdle, if there's some sort of bottleneck that's prohibiting animals from getting there, relocations, reintroductions are indeed an option. But we do have a permit and a set of requirements that must be followed before that proceeds. And that again is taken into all sorts of considerations about animal safety and health, and basically trying to increase the odds that we have a successful effort. And some of the folks on the call here today have been directly involved in some of those ongoing projects. And so we get involved enormously on those reintroduction efforts. And we do things like we even work with the Oregon Zoo on holding facilities. We also work with tribes on moving beaver on tribal lands, moving beaver to tribal lands, and also working with trappers and trying to help with some of those efforts, or trying to get them to stay out of a location where we don't want to try to have beaver taking hold. Another major topic is science and information that we have authority over, have our fingers involved with. First off, very simply being our fur bearer reporting requirements. All licensed fur takers are required to report on their activities. We get a great deal of information from that, and also creates basically a database of subject matter experts that we can contact at any moment to find out greater detail and fine scales about activities, intent, etc. We have our own research shops. We've done beaver research in Oregon, and still continue to collaborate with other researchers on various different topics, and also a number of our collaborators, both through agencies and NGOs. And again, as I mentioned previously, we do regulate the take or the holding of beaver requiring a scientific take permit. So we are one of those kind of hoops that have to be jumped through, but ultimately we can continue to better facilitate those types of projects, encourage those types of projects, and make sure that that paperwork really is pretty mild and pretty easy to work through. So we also play a pretty significant role in our management through our involvement in conservation and management projects, plans, and related policy. Now, this is sometimes a little bit more of not an immediate oversight of the agency, but a demonstrated action in so many different arenas throughout our agency, such as for beaver specifically, we call for and support habitat management for beaver in the management plans and in policies of primarily the land management agencies. We also encourage funding for beaver related projects through the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund, and working with OEB and project reviews, and providing support for projects that can help fill some of those important knowledge gaps. Not as much the case that's been demonstrated in Beaver, but certainly a major area that we've demonstrated repeatedly in wildlife management, which is working with collaborators to try to impact policy or to develop actions such as road closures, road crossings, reducing speed limits, closing areas to access to try to reduce harassment, try to reduce negative encounters for both humans and both for wildlife. And so we also have, demonstrated our involvement on private land, but I'm going to probably skip over that right now. But for a lot of these beaver topics, there hasn't been a lot of demonstrated use of some of those tools yet, but they are indeed on the table. Kind of like, as I said earlier today, we're trying to bring more things to the table to look at what all of our options are on a case-by-case basis. But very simply, if some folks are having troubles kind of comprehending how this would look in the beaver world, we definitely have lots of other models to provide of how this has looked, say, for mule deer or other species like that, where we have the ability to work with the collaborators to do things like improve land management, improve habitat for the focal species, try to improve conditions for that focal species, even though the agency is not technically the agency in charge of enacting those types of changes. So that's pretty much all I have. I'll punt to Tom now, and then we'll take questions after.
Thanks, Derek. So I was going to go over some of our involvement in beaver-related habitat or structures, and the differences between what we have authority over and where we're actively involved in management, even if we don't have direct authority. Some of the things that Derek was just alluding to. So I'll start off with fish passage. That is something ODFW has authority over, and there's a number of ways that beaver-related structures fall under that. I'll start out with beaver dam removal. We're often asked about that. Beaver dams are not considered an artificial obstruction, subject to our fish passage laws, and we certainly don't encourage removal removal of dams for fish passage purposes. And we do, as we talk about beaver dam removal with folks, we do recognize the need for practical, efficient, cost-effective, non-lethal solutions when they're looking at damage issues, things like that. And the actual removal of structures would potentially be regulated by either the Department of State Lands, mostly on federal lands. I think our Department of State Lands would have some authority on there. I'm not exactly sure what the current requirements are there, but I know a couple of years ago they had some requirements around, removal fill in streams, and beaver dams would be considered under that. In terms of providing fish passage at beaver dams, if people, or if you want to install an artificial structure such as pond leveling device at a beaver dam, that does then get into fish passage regulation. So on that front, we are currently in development of guidance with other partners as part of kind of the Beaver Restoration Guidebook update, kind of what exactly our guidance is in terms of adding pond leveling structures at beaver dams. Similar with beaver exclusion devices in streams. Oftentimes at, say, a culvert, people might want to install a beaver exclusion or fence device to limit beaver dam impacts. That's another thing that could have some fish passage implications. So that's another thing that would fall under our fish passage rules. Again, we're currently developing more generalized guidance on that. Those aren't done. In terms of human structures that are intended to mimic or encourage beaver dams, beaver dam analogs, vertical post structures, things like that, those are also things, if they're full spanning of a channel, that are going to be covered under our fish passage laws. We do have some new guidance that came out, new guidance and a new streamlined application process for these that came out. It was early this year or last year, forgetting when that came out, but that is something we also regulate and have some new guidance on that. That's consistent with what's in the Beaver Restoration Guidebook on those types of structures. There, just as a side note, Oregon State Lands and possibly the Oregon Water Resources Department might also have some jurisdictional authority in terms of putting structure in streams as well as impounding water. So that's where we primarily have the direct authority over things, and but obviously conserving habitat is part of the agency's mission, and we do a lot of different work with other entities on that front. And just to build on some of the things that Derek said related to beaver as the animal, we certainly have in a lot of our conservation and recovery plans for fish, references and actions associated with increasing beaver related habitat that benefit those fish. And we implement those things through a myriad of habitat based actions and approaches for stream restoration and protection, for watershed function. And here I'll just kind of go over kind of some of the broad places that we do this in terms of habitat, and beaver related needs are certainly fit under these umbrellas. We have staff that are in our district offices that are working on habitat based things, and we have programs across the agency that are numerous programs across the agency that deal with habitat based things, and they can all get involved in beaver related activity. We're coordinating with land managers, watershed councils, landowners, other agencies, funding entities around all of these habitat things, from a site specific level to a forest level to statewide policy. A lot of different areas there in both involvement for restoration and protection. Derek mentioned a few funding, ODFW funding opportunities that we have. We also have tax incentives programs. There's a riparian land tax incentive program and a wildlife habitat conservation and management program tax incentives that both can provide tax incentives to landowners for beneficial riparian and wildlife habitat conservation actions. Let's see. Recently, as we were, the state was reacting to especially the 2020 wildfires, ODFW was bringing in how to, in wildfire response, what are best practices or ideal outcomes that would benefit beaver. We are also thinking about kind of emerging riparian management guidance around beaver. We've had guidance for several decades around creating large wood and shade in riparian areas to benefit fish. That's not necessarily in all locations the best outcome to encourage beaver presence or dam building. So we're thinking about how to modify that message in terms of riparian management. I think that's a little bit of a tricky and nuanced thing. So that's an emerging need that we see that we're working on. I will make a note about, we do have a new habitat division that's coming online, approved by the legislature this last session. And that division will bring many of our existing programs that I mentioned or that I referenced under that one division. They are currently in fish division and wildlife division, the habitat-based pieces, as well as in some of our regions, and we'll be putting them under one umbrella. Also, there's the science and information side of things, where we are collecting information. As a side note, at the August meeting, we were going to present some of that information, and I think it has bearing to some of the previous conversation around, you know, what are the trends on federal land, private land, places where we largely have had closures and haven't. So I think there's information we can bring to bear to thoughts on that. So we collect those information. We are currently trying to develop an eDNA monitoring program across the state for multiple species, fish, and other aquatic species, including beavers. So that's something coming down the road. I know that beaver presence in areas is questioned. So this will help provide more information on that. We certainly also, as Derek mentioned, on the scientific take permit front, we do have authority over the take of fish and other wildlife if you're looking at responses of those species to things you're doing with respect to either beaver dams or artificial beaver structures, and want to sample those other species. We have the scientific take authority there. And we certainly work and coordinate with other researchers as they're developing and implementing research around various topics. Outside of kind of the beaver related things, there's a couple other kind of coordination venues, if you will, that ODFW has been involved with. We have a Beaver Coordination Forum that has met about annually. That used to be called the Beaver Work Group for a number of years. We've recently changed the name of that because this is also a Beaver Work Group. Wanted to avoid confusion and kind of re-characterize that group for kind of what it has been in the most recent years, which is really coordinating information and pulling people together to have discussions about how to get information out there and around all aspects of beaver management. We also coordinate with other agencies directly. Notably, we coordinate with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service around beaver related issues. And let's see, I think I'll leave it at that. A broad host of different activities and involvement at various different levels. So with that, I think we can maybe open it up to questions from folks.
Yeah, thanks, Tom and Derek. And before I don't see any hands up yet. So while we're waiting for any hands to come up, Derek and Tom, and maybe this is a question for Kevin and Shannon, when you talk about the new habitat division coming on board and that right now you've got beaver related management actions spread across wildlife, across fish, across, the district level, it's kind of in a lot of different places. Can you either of you talk a little bit about time frame associated with kind of rolling those up under the habitat division? What can this group expect?
Yeah, this is Kevin. Shannon had to step out for a bit. So we're rolling up the habitat division, trying to do implementation and that kind of integration as quick as we can. We've got the recruitment for the division program manager. So we'll be probably, we have an outline of what is in the division, what programs are there. Species management stuff really still stays in the divisions, but some of the resource management stuff we're talking about, including direct habitat action implementation, that is over in the habitat division. So, and we also have some new employees coming on in that division. So we're expecting, fully to try to integrate a lot of that by the time we get through our first fiscal year. So, we're just moving as quick as we can, but there isn't a lot of change in regards to what people are going to see immediately for actions related to beaver management, particularly in regards to a lot of Tom described interactions back with other agencies, whether that's Division of State Lands, et cetera. Those are pretty much be a seamless transition over the Habitat Division. They'll just be sitting in a new place, so to speak. But not much change in or a lack of doing some work. So.
Thanks for that clarification, Kevin. Jefferson, I see your hand up.
Well, sometimes I tend to get optimistically excited, but I'm pretty excited by what Tom and Derek were saying, because I keep having people tell me, well, ODFW can't work on habitat, and like our hands are tied on this, and that wasn't really syncing with what I've, like, the awesome stuff that I've seen you guys work on. You're doing elk habitat outside of Bend here, changing land management recommendations and such as that. And so I thought, oh, let's see how that might be with Beaver. And it doesn't seem like there's an inherent reason built in that any of those tools that have been used on anything else couldn't be used on Beaver as well. But what I see as particularly making me happy right now is that in these discussions of limiting factors, and even in that heated discussion earlier of this is the limiting factor, or this isn't the limiting factor, I'm not saying it's the only limiting factor, is that there are a lot of factors that are involved here, and that ODFW, it seems, in fact, has its potential fingers in all of these factors, that it has the possibility to impact habitat and what the National Forest or BLM does on public lands. It has the ability to take the data to track the pros and cons of management actions. It has the ability to talk about what goes on in streams, what you can and can't do. It has the ability to fund worthwhile projects with grants and other things. And that, I won't say it's a one-stop shop, but that it really, if we were to look at an area and say, these are the factors, what can we do there? There's a way to address potentially levers to pull on a lot of these limiting factors. And so I do see that as that's a good thing.
Yeah, thanks, Jefferson. We certainly are involved in all those things we mentioned and you referenced there. I would just like to point out, though, on a number of the habitat-based things, we don't have the ability to force something on folks, because we don't have that direct authority. It's more working with partners, land managers, watershed councils, things like that. Fish passage is a little different. We do have authority directly there, but all the rest of that is working with others, rather than us being, the sole movers, if you will, on that. Just for clarification.
Other questions for Derek and Tom or Kevin? The point of what we were trying to have them share with you is just to give you, like Jefferson said, that sense of that, there's a wide range of ways that ODFW can help affect addressing the limiting factors that we've identified, in addition to closure. There are a number of ways, and in some areas they might want to do a different recipe or suite of management options as opposed to in other areas. And I don't know that we've gotten down to that level of detail yet, but it seems like that's probably where we should start to go to get this a little more rooted and more concrete. Greg?
Okay, so related to that, and maybe this is for Tom. So you mentioned, for example, DSL may have some authority on human-made structures in rivers. So I'm trying to get a sense of what agency trumps whom. Is it just simply a partnership to talk, to collaborate on something like that, or who exactly is the permitting agency, which I think maybe state lands and not ODFW, but it would be ODFW if it really impacts fish passage. And so I don't know if there's just any clarification you could provide on that, Tom. I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, sure, Commissioner Woolley. All the laws and requirements are confusing. Department of State Land regulates the removal and fill of material in streams and waterways of the state. So that's kind of the primary thing. So if you're want to take a beaver dam out, for instance, you want to check with them to see what their requirements are. There may be some volumetric thresholds where you need a permit or you don't. But if you're taking material out or want to put material in, such as, artificial beaver dam mimicking structures, they kind of regulate that. On top of that, if those things are full spanning, or if you would need to deal with ODFW on the fish passage side of things. So there's kind of two different aspects and permits, if you will, or authorizations that you would need. So you'd need to get the approval to remove or place the material from Department of State Lands, and then kind of the approval from ODFW to make sure how you're doing that meets our fish passage requirements.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Tom.
Jefferson?
Sorry if I'm hogging the time. I just wanted to ask, with all the different ways that you are weighing these objectives, and with all the multiple use that goes on related to wildlife and the benefits of wildlife, is there a metric or a decision matrices that you use to weigh those things? Because some decisions are good for one use and are not good for the other use. How do you justify some of those actions in terms of none of them are ever going to make everyone happy?
I don't know which of us is supposed to take that one, because it's in some cases that's almost the definition of what we do, where we seem to almost never make genuinely everybody happy. But that's the job. It's weighing those things. And fortunately, I think that this is a blessing, but because we have public rulemaking processes, we have that opportunity to engage the public to weigh those pros and cons. And so some of these management tools, require a ton of buy-in, especially if we're talking about closing access to benefit one species or one group of users. That gets really hairy, and I'm sure BLM and Forest Service folks can talk about how sensitive that topic is. So yeah, but that's ultimately, I think, what this group can get at is, let's try to identify our priorities here, so that way we can decide where do the cons live in focusing on some of those priorities.
Chris? Hey, Chris, you're still muted.
Oh, thought I pushed the button. Sorry. Two quick comments. One, sort of following up what Tom, you were just saying about the DSL permits. Yeah, it seems like the statutory authority is with DSL for cut and fill work, but there is a provision in salmon habitat of needing to check in with the district fish bio to make sure that the biological impacts of that work is still consistent, while the cut and fill aspects are so there is a linkage built into that, even if it's not directly in ODFW's authority, that you play an expert consultation role. Along those same lines, I was wondering, so NOAA fisheries in the ESA recovery plans for salmonids have in many places beaver habitat, beaver landscape features as critical components, even as rising to the level of one of the key limiting factors for Oregon Coast coho. I'm wondering, in conservation plans or species management plans that you have in the state, and I guess this would be both for both Derek and for Tom, have you put beaver floodplain modified habitat or beaver features into those as necessary elements into those plans, and then figured out how to actually so we have examples of how you've worked through that process? I mean, that would be really cool if that's, you've already say, yeah, we've done that for, Oregon chub, and this is how we implemented it, being creative with our authority.
So I guess I'll answer that from the fish perspective. So we have implementation coordinators for a number of our conservation and recovery plans. Conservation plans are kind of just state plans. Recovery plans are federal plans. Some of them are the exact same thing. But we have implementation coordinators that work on implementing all the actions and coordinating with others to get those on the ground. So the beaver piece is one action of many. I cannot say that we have focused in any one area 100% of our time on beavers, because there are a whole host and suite of actions that are called for in those plans. And we just haven't had the funding capacity to focus just on that one topic. So it gets worked into a number of different people's daily requirements and jobs, and kind of how they're interacting with others.
Leland?
Thanks. Sorry, I'll apologize if I just missed this. But as we're talking specifically about federal lands, there seems to be kind of a broader discussion about authority. And just to clarify, any action taken on federal land would have to be a collaborative effort between that federal land management agency, ODFW, and if you're doing some changes to the stream itself, you're including DSL or another agency on top of that? Or am I making this harder than it needs to be?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on all the habitat-based things. It would be collaborative. You certainly, the federal land management agency would need to be on board and involved. And then there's all these other things that kind of get layered on top of that.
Okay, and then so within that, are there then become formal agreements in doing those projects? I mean, are you creating MOUs or using other?
I think it depends on the specific project.
Sure.
A lot of the time, if for instance, we work with a local office of say the Forest Service or BLM on a project, it's you talk about the project, then the service or BLM would apply for and get the permits, and ideally you've coordinated beforehand and that all goes smoothly. Some cases there are MOUs in place, but that's not necessarily gonna have to be in place.
Sure.
Others may know more about that.
I was just going to say, Tom, if I can pause you, Tom. Darren, I saw that your hand went up, and I think that you probably have some information related to what Leland and Tom are talking about?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure everybody knows that anytime we're doing any work with ODFW and other entities at all, we usually do have MOUs in place. We have longstanding MOU. Anytime we do projects, we have to go through the NEPA process and everything else. So the public has input in that and everything too. So.
Appreciate it. I just wanted to clarify kind of where those layers start and end, because initially it seemed like we were talking about kind of broad, any landowner, and we really just refocus that onto federal lands. So thank you.
Ernie, I think that you were next. I see Samantha and Brian's hands up as well. And so I'm going to ask that Ernie, Samantha, and Brian be our last speakers on this topic, because I do want to just do a few minute wrap up before we close at 4. So Ernie, I think you've been waiting the longest of the three of you, but go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I would like to throw this issue in and see in the context of all that you've been talking about, MOUs and projects and consultations and the like, given the information coming out about climate change and the latest IPCC report and the like, has ODFW modified its perspective? Will ODFW modify its perspective in effect to adopt the precautionary principle really rigorously? And so that you reject a proposal for a road or a project or timber sale or whatnot that's going to affect fish passage or any of the other resources that you have that are related to beaver, unless that sponsor can provide conclusive evidence that it will not have a negative effect on beaver. So that instead of saying, well, we're going to do it unless it really has a bad impact on beaver, and then we might not do it, instead you turn it upside down and you say, no, you don't get to do things that might have a bad effect until you can show for sure that it won't. Can you move in that direction? Have you moved in that direction?
Yeah, I'll respond to that, Ernie. We certainly move in that direction. The examples you gave, we do not have the direct authority to say yes or no on, but as Chris pointed out, and I alluded to when I was talking in kind of other agencies' regulatory processes, we are providing comments. And climate change is really just going to be exacerbating all of the things we've been concerned with in terms of habitat impacts, for decades. So we have been working in that direction and will continue to do so.
Brian?
Oh, yeah. Hi, everybody. So a few meetings ago, I think there was an acknowledgement that in the document, I forgot whether it was called Living with Beavers or Working with Beavers, but sort of the ODFW guidance document, that maybe there was a misstatement in there that people who had a lease on federally managed public land were entitled to treat the beavers as though they were on private land as a predatory species. And I'm wondering if, I'm not sure if that statement is in other materials as well, like on the website independent of that PDF document. I'm just kind of curious if anything's been done to clarify that or update that. And then second of all, I thought when we had that discussion, there was maybe going to be some inquiries about whether, there were in fact private actors with leases on federally managed public land that, had been treating beavers as predatory and not subject to the fur bearer regulations.
So you're just asking,
I was curious what came of those inquiries, if there were any.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure if Marianne was going to be looking into that. I don't recall.
I have an answer to that question, Jamie, but I had an independent question with my hand, if my hand could still stay up independently.
Of answering that question?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I apologize for not being on video. I had to get in the car and move to my next location. So, Brian, I did, and I can't remember, I thought I said this in one of the meetings, but I apologize if I didn't. I talked to kind of all of our folks and OCA folks, Oregon Cattlemen's Association folks that have, particularly on the west side, any public lands leases, and every single one of them was like really confused by the question and said, no, we don't do any beaver management. That's not something we're undertaking. That's not something that they've seen a need to do on those leased rangelands. And Brian, I always understood the lease piece to mean like leasing of private land. Like if I'm a leasee of private land, that I have kind of the rights relative to wildlife as the landowner. And so that probably be an ODFW clarification, but I never understood that lease language because they're not leases, they're permits on federal land, at least for grazing. So they're not treated like a lease in any context. They're a federally issued permit. So I don't know if either of those answers are helpful, but yes, not to my knowledge, no significant take of beaver, and in fact, no identified take of beaver from any of our permittees. And I talked to quite a few folks, and there's not a ton of West Side grazing permits anymore, but I think I talked to a pretty good cross section of folks that do have those that remain. So yeah, is that helpful?
Yeah, thanks for that. I didn't want to lose sight of the first part of the question, whether anything's being done to update the official literature.
Yeah, that would be for Derek and Tom.
Yeah, we talked about this before, Brian. Like there is an understanding in the field and amongst the public and our staff on the interpretation of that. And Marianne is right. It's best almost kind of think of it in terms of residency, leasing a property, leasing private property. It doesn't apply to the public lands. Even public land agencies have to get a permit from ODFW to take a beaver on those lands, even if they're causing damage, unless they work with a permitted entity such as a wildlife control operator, wildlife services and such. So that document, again, we talked about kind of its needs to be dusted off. I think that perhaps even out of what this group wants to do and focus on, I think we could probably almost just scrap it and start from fresh and talk about what really matters, not get hung up on some of those little details.
Thanks, Derek. So we've got 2 minutes left. Sam, you've been waiting a long time.
Thank you. I have a small human that keeps trying to crawl on top of my screen, so I apologize if that happens again. No, I was more interested in the wildlife services interplay with the permitting process, and we don't have enough time to get into that, so we can shelve that for later.
Can you, well, actually, I'm sure that my Sam has made a note of that, so that's something for us to follow up on.
Yeah. Just in hearing them mention it, it seems like Wildlife Services is permitted to take beaver on federally managed lands for leases. So I want to make sure we have all the regulatory information we need to consider it.
Thanks for that. So we have 1 minute left, and we've got 3 speakers. I don't see anybody putting their hand down. Let's go ahead. Greg, do you have a question, or is it a?
Just a really brief comment regarding the precautionary principle and Ernie's comment about that. And so, and our, the commissioners can weigh in if they like, but, I feel that our commission has been leaning more and more toward considering the precautionary principle. I don't believe our department has made a statement per se, similar to what you stated, Ernie, say in response to the UN report or something like that. But an example is with the marbled murrelet, which we recently decided to uplist from threatened to endangered and develop habitat conservation plans with in partnering land management agencies. We strongly considered climate change. We strongly considered habitat fragmentation, and no one stated that the species was in imminent danger of extinction in the very short term, but we were looking at the longer term and the changes that are occurring in the landscape and the changes that are occurring in the climate in order for us to make the decision that we made. And so that is a strong tendency of our commission, the direction that we're leaning more and more as we have our discussions and debate these controversial issues.
Thanks, Greg. Last two questions, Marianne.
Yeah, and I just a clarification from earlier, because Samantha's comment made me think it wasn't maybe obvious. Our folks are not themselves trapping for permittees from my informal survey of them. It can be really brief, and maybe it's another flag for later. Is I feel since I've heard today, I've heard a lot of comments around kind of what I term more regulatory.
Hey, Marianne, you're breaking up pretty bad.
Okay, I'll stop.
Okay. You follow up with me with an email so that we have make sure we capture what your comment is, and we can include it in the meeting summary. Leland, you get the last word.
I apologize to everybody for that. So I just wanted to bring up, I mean, we've talked about the, the predatory designation on federal land and leases and all that. And, if there's concerns about that language, as Derek said, that can be something this working group addresses and would be an outcome of the recommendation from the group. Mary Ann's comment about, using incentives versus regulation for some of that is important, but, that may not matter on federal lands because there already is process in place for how permittees can use the land. And if all it is clarification of what that actually is, that's a fairly easy outcome for us.
Thanks for that, Leland. All right, I apologize for being a couple minutes over. And but our next meeting is October 13th. I want to remind everybody that while there were portions of this meeting that may not have felt as satisfying as everybody would like, that we are in the middle of a conversation, and it does feel disjointed when we can't be in the same room and just have a regular conversation with each other. The subgroup is going to meet to continue to try to focus in on bringing forward information that is the most useful for us in developing some recommendations. We've got 2 meetings in October, so we're really hoping that the cadence of these meetings will make this conversation feel a little bit more, cohesive. And so hopefully that is the case. And then are both the meetings from 2 to 5, Sam?
So we just wanted to report back. We heard from a lot of folks on the doodle poll about extending the meetings, and the unanimous kind of vote was to extend both to 2 to 5 p.m.
Okay, thank you for that. And we just tend to run out of time, in having these discussions. So as we get closer to trying to actually put some words on paper that our recommendations, from this group, we're going to really need a little bit more time to discuss and make that happen. So I appreciate everybody's contributions. I feel like a lot of people weighed in on the meeting today. Thank you to our viewing audience for hanging with us as we are working through these difficult discussions. And certainly anybody can follow up with Sam and I between meetings, and a lot of you have done that. And so we will see you on October 13th. Thanks for everybody's